Hey folks, it's V the Grill Economist, and I'm live. It's the Sirius report. I accidentally hit the live button, so we're live now, and we're just waiting for London Paul to show up, and London Paul will be here at any second. So we just got that. Anyway, folks, if you haven't done so already, check out the SiriusReport.com, thesiriusreport.com, where you can have your daily briefings. You can have all the goings on of the world daily given to you by Paul himself, and he'll be able to give you the breakdown and the play-by-play for less than the price of a Cascara Sagrada cold brew coffee at your local Starbucks. London Paul is able to do that for us. And with that being said, London Paul, what's up, buddy? How are you? We're live. I accidentally hit the live button.
Good morning, V. Yeah, I was just kind of minding my own business and suddenly thought, oh, hang on, they've gone live.
Yeah. I apologize, man. I got a little too trigger happy. I didn't even.
Hey,
Oh,
don't
crap.
worry about it. It's fine.
Anyway, Paul, what's going on, buddy? A lot of things going on in the world. Where do you want to begin?
Where do we begin? I guess really, in terms of US foreign policy, the next, I would say, month or so is going to be pretty significant in terms of which way the US goes on a number of points. I think in very broad terms, you've got the Iranian nuclear deal, which is supposed to be up for negotiation or renegotiation, whatever the Trump administration wants to do on the 12th of May. You've got the North Korea meeting, which may happen in May or maybe it's in June, but within ballpark a month. Then there's what does the US do next in Syria? And I think a good kind of starting point is, well, Pompeo, I think for me is an interesting development because we know Pompeo went to Saudi Arabia. Now, by all accounts, he's pushing nations to impose more sanctions on Iran or entities that aid what he calls Iran's missile program. So what I think we're leading to is one possibility. Well, there's three possibilities. The US does nothing. The US completely walks away from the Iran deal, or the US tries to impose more sanctions. But I think the ultimate aim is they want to stop Iran producing any missiles, which basically means that Iran can't defend itself against anyone. So then it's effectively would become a sitting duck, which I can't really see Iran agreeing to. But anyway, I think as I say, they want to sanction individuals or entities associated with Iran's missile program. That's partly been discussions with European nations, which came out of what's been discussed, I guess, when Merkel and Macron were in Washington recently. My slight concern with regards to Pompeo's visit is that we see on the one hand Britain, France, Germany, Russia, China are urging Washington to remain part of the deal. Trump keeps saying that Tehran's violated the spirit of the deal by continuing to test ballistic missiles. And he keeps going on about they're fomenting this violence in the Middle East. In his speech with Merkel, he referred to them in a variety of ways. But he called them murderous regime, and wherever there's terrorism in the world, they're involved, which of course is absolute nonsense, which we know is the case. He continues to say, obviously, Pompeo said there's no decision yet being made on US participation in the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. Now, what he has said, of course, is that unless the substantial changes are made, it's unlikely Trump will remain in the deal. Now, it's said that Pompeo met with MBS and King Salman. I can't validate whether he met with one of them, both of them, or neither of them. I think what's therefore interesting is he then went on to Iran, and Iran seemed very enthused by Pompeo's attitude. Sorry, he went to Israel, and it seems that Tel Aviv was very enthused by Pompeo's stance on Iran. Now, then we come to last night, sort of what was around kind of 10 o'clock my time, so sort of 5 p.m. US time. well, Eastern Standard Time. And then there was reports coming out of these huge explosions in the Hamar province saying that Iranian and Syrian military sites were targeted by Israeli warplanes. There's numerous different takes on the event. Some are saying there was 30 odd Syrian military forces killed and dozens injured, and that the target was this Brigade 47 in the Hamar province where Iranian forces operate. Now, the Iranians, for some reason, have denied the fact that missiles hit the Iranian base in Syria, and in fact, it's all just absolute nonsense. Well, there was footage. The question is that footage legitimate? I suspect it is, so I don't know why the Iranians are denying it. My only concern is it mere coincidence that Pompeo visits Saudi and visits Israel, and then the Israelis strike? It might be a big coincidence, it might not be. I think what is self-evident, though, and you touched on it earlier, because obviously I listened in to the morning show, Israel and the Saudi Arabia are on their last legs. It's blatantly obvious that the Israelis are trying to provoke Iran. They want a response from Iran. They want Iran to react and to start a war, which Iran is not going to do because they realize the insanity of doing that. It remains to be seen if the Israelis even admit to this attack. It'll be interesting to see what the Russian response was, because Russia said they wouldn't tolerate these attacks anymore. Now, Russia's response isn't to just go out and do something hot-headed. So it remains to be seen how the Russians will respond to it. I think the issue of the nuclear agreement has even more significance, simply on the basis that if the US does nothing and just kicks the can down the road with the nuclear agreement, then that's one aspect that will annoy and irritate the Israelis. If they walk away from it, then that's just going to add fuel to the fire with regards to what happens in the Middle East. Because the question is, as much as Israel doesn't like the nuclear agreement, and Netanyahu said this, and okay, people will argue, do we take what he says on face value? But he's often said, we don't like the agreement. But the one thing the Israelis don't want is the US to walk away from the agreement collapses. Because the truth is, where's the contingency? What's the strategic plan going forward? There isn't one. Does the US have one with regards to Iran? What do the rest of the nations do? Hang in there and stick with the agreement? Well, they might try to, but is that feasible? Will Iran just walk away from it? As much as we may say the Israelis are desperate, I don't think they're that desperate to enter into a completely unknown situation if the nuclear agreement collapses. So therefore, we can't say with any degree of certainty what the outcome will be, but it's likely they may just try to impose more sanctions on Iran. And frankly, we know what sanctions do. They never work. So it will become irrelevant. If they walk away from it, then it's a major problem. If they just kick the can down the road and go, well, we're going to review the situation in a few months, then, all one good. But walking away from it would be an utter disaster for not just the nuclear deal, not for the Middle East, but for the US as well. So I would have concerns, though, why the timing of the Iranian attack, whatever it is, and it's yet to be confirmed precisely what happened. But I think the timing of Pompeo being in Saudi and Israel's a little bit concerning, that on the same days in Israel, they launch this missile attack and patently just to enrage and anger the Iranians, who sensibly haven't responded. I don't think they would be stupid enough to respond in that regard. So, because it seems whoever it is in Israel wants a war with Iran, they're doing everything to provoke them. So the question is the US going to respond to that? Well, intelligently, you would think absolutely not. They were just not going to get involved in that. But then the question is, we knew from last time when they had the T4 base that was struck by the Israelis, that they were given approval to do that by the Trump administration. So the question is, well, is it the same again? We're coming down to that route. Were they given basically tacit approval to go and do it again? If that is so, that's a very serious development and a very major problem. Because And it kind of contradicts what most people's belief is in what the US wants to do in Syria. And we come back to the point that Trump says, I want to leave, and then these whole series of events happen. And then we find the US is putting more bases, as we said last week, into Syria. This isn't indicative of a nation that's looking to walk away from Syria anytime soon. Now, there can be a whole bunch of reasons why they don't want to walk away anytime soon, but too many catalytic events happened after Trump said we want to walk away and leave Syria. And that concerns me also. I don't have any doubt that in the Middle East, the Saudis and the Israelis are imploding, but a lot of the Israelis' concerns regarding Iran is a largely paranoia induced, as we've said before. Well,
Correct.
the last thing the US needs to do is feed that paranoia.
Yeah.
Because
they're very paranoid out there.
So that for me is a major concern. I mean, it's very difficult, and then to understand precisely what the viewpoint is coming out. I mean, Mattis made some interesting comment, which also concerned me, is when he said that the risk of a direct conflict between Israeli and Iranian forces is very likely. Because he says Iran continues to do its proxy work through Hezbollah, which, again, is a ridiculous statement. And then he said that I can't see how it might start. He says, I can see how it might start, but I'm not sure when and where. And then Mattis's counterpart, which is the Israeli Defense Minister Lieberman, he met with Mattis. And he also met with John Bolton, who he called a loyal friend to the state of Israel.
The maniacal mustache is a very, very frightening creature.
And yeah, and that's the point that concerns me is, okay, we don't exactly know what Pompeo's stance is and whether it was just a mere coincidence he rolls into Saudi and Israel and something happened. But certainly Bolton is a major concern. And Pompeo has gone on record as saying it's unlikely Trump will keep the US in the Iran deal. Sorry, excuse me. And he says, my view is I don't know what, in terms of Macron made an interesting observation at the back end of last week when he said, my view is I don't know what your president will decide. But is it that he will get rid of this deal on his own for domestic reasons? So he's inferring the US may walk away for domestic reasons. Well, what are the domestic reasons? Now, Macron could be completely barking up the wrong tree. But why does he think that? There's a number of reasons, and there's no point speculating what they are. And then he said, if you heard him in the Oval Office, you'll have come to the same conclusions. And then pointed out, ripping up the Iran deal was one of Trump's campaign promises, which of course it was. Now, this is why, as much as there's all this idea of, that Trump isn't cabal, and he certainly isn't, we come back to the point, he seems to be getting very bad advice, and potentially walking away from the Iranian deal is a very, very retrograde step. It's not going to do anything. It's the one thing the capitalists want to happen. They don't want further sanctions because that just doesn't do anything. And if they kick the can down the road, then the status quo remains the same, and then therefore there's no concern or issue with regards to what's going to happen with respect to Iran. So we're kind of in a melting pot with regards to what happens on the 12th, and until then we're not sure, but all the indications are either Trump's going to walk away from it, or there's going to be some renegotiation. The one thing, as much as we don't like Merkel or Macron, they make a point of saying, well, okay, the deal's not perfect, even though Iran's doing everything the deal said they should do, they're adhering to, and no one's disagreeing with that. But I think they're trying to pacify Washington and say, well, okay, if you don't agree with the deal, let's try and bolt some addendums on the side of that deal that may include suppressing their capability to launch missiles. But at the end of the day, how is Iran going to say, well, okay, it's one thing not allowing us to have nuclear capability, and by the way, we weren't even doing that anyway. There's another thing saying, well, actually, by the way, you're not allowed to have any missile technology whatsoever. So what does that make them? Sitting ducks? No nation on this planet is going to agree to that. So that would, if they do pursue that route, Iran's just going to walk away from the deal and go, forget it, there's no point having it. And from their perspective, you can't disagree with that.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's I mean, all this is in all of this. Every single one of these events that are all these events that are happening in the Middle East centers around one thing and one thing alone: the death of the petrodollar.
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, what the way the cabal dies, and the only way they die is when the dollar dies. With the end of
Correct.
when you have the end of the Federal Reserve note, and their capability to do anything is stops immediately. They they can't finance anything, and the rejection of the dollar is equally important because the day the world totally rejects the dollar, then they're finished as well. Because the whole point they've been able to do anything is because they can export their debt. If no one in the world wants to buy the debt and the dollar gets rejected, then their capability to do anything is over. And it boils down to that in a very broad sense. Okay, there's a whole bunch of, well, many things that happen in the process, but in a very crude sense, that's their demise. That's the end of it. So yeah, the death of the petrodollar is a hugely important factor in what we've discussed.
Absolutely correct. Paul, what's the latest goings on in the Asian markets in China, One Belt One Road, and how that links with the foreign policy of the United States? What's your take?
Well, the problem is, you know, we have to start with the whole trade tariff thing, and I know we've
Yeah.
talked about this before, but the bottom line is in I mean, we'll talk about Merkel in a bit because obviously Merkel visited Washington last Friday. I think there were some interesting points to take out of it. But in terms of the whole position of Trump, and what he's basically saying is we want a reciprocal relationship, and we want to reduce the trade deficit with China, and we want to reduce the trade deficit with the likes of the EU. And this is all fine, and it all sounds great to make these business deals. But the problem is, he address the US deficiencies in that regard, why the deficit is so high, and how currently they're in no position to address that problem because they don't have the finance. I mean, something that came up a few days ago, which just eloquently proves the fact that Trump's idea of attracting business into in the UK is that Ford's basically giving up on the US car business, and General Motors appears to be not too far behind it. Ford's going to reduce its passenger car lineup to just 2 models. And General Motors is saying we're having difficulty selling passenger cars in the US
Well, I think that
because,
has a lot to
yeah,
do with the fact the Americans are frenzied over SUVs because
well,
SUV
yes, that's
sales are like
true.
quadrupling in terms of
Yeah,
car.
that's true, and I'm not disputing that. But the problem is when you're having trouble with your own homegrown companies selling in your domestic markets, it's very hard to be critical of other nations saying, well, actually, this trade imbalance is all your fault when the US can't sort its own industrial problems out. And in 18, well, not 18 months to be fair to Trump, but what, 15 months of his actual presidency, they've done nothing to address those problems and resolve them in any way, shape, or form. So, the other question is, he makes the idea the World Trade Organization's, has been very detrimental to the US. Well, actually, if you look at how the US has used the World Trade Organization for its own benefits, that's simply not the case. And also, he fails to address that the US has benefited for decades having the world's reserve currency. Now, he's not going to admit any of this publicly because, of course, you wouldn't do that. But privately, you think you'd be sat there going, hang on a minute, we're in no position to call the shots with any nation. And it's like China. The problem with doing this to the Chinese is that China's only going to reciprocate the issue. So will the European Union nations, including the UK. They're not going to stand there and just tolerate this. It's not going to. It's just a complete defeat for all sides. In the end, nobody wins as a result of this. And yet, in the same breath, who's going to finance? Who's going to back the US to rebuild the nation whenever that happens? They're going to be dependent on the Chinese. So, and meanwhile, yeah, in terms of the One Belt, One Road, we're even starting to, as we said, see inroads into Europe. But the Chinese are constantly modifying and changing their own economy to cope with the future, which is going to be more consumption based. But they're intelligently lining up so they can benefit from the consumption phase by being the supplier as well, by investing in other nations, and it just continues. The bandwagon continues. There's nothing to end it. But the attitude in Western nations towards, I mean, I think there was an EU meeting, and at this stage, 27 out of 28 EU nations were reticent about the One Belt, One Road. The only nation who's really up for it properly is the Hungarians. And even all the rest of them are having and hawing, going, well, you know, China is going to exploit us. It's just a method of coming into our country and taking our assets and exploiting us. And I mean, and some of the complaints levied at China as a result of this are just farcical. So there's still resistance in Europe. Eventually that resistance will be broken down. And the one thing, if you impose tariffs as Trump does on the EU, and I mean, they talked, we'll talk about, as we said, Merkel in a minute, but Merkel's point was, we don't really know what's going to happen with steel and aluminium, because, you know, in a couple of days, is Trump going to, you know, continue to invoke those tariffs, or is he going to rescind them? Are we going to start to have some way of moving forward in that regard, rather than penalising us as they're penalising the Chinese and the Russians, etc.? So, and the question is, well, if they can't resolve these differences, what's the EU going to do? It's going to turn around and go, well, there's only one way forward. We're going to have to jump into bed with the Russians and the Chinese and start to trade with them. And all of a sudden, this idea of nations being fearful of the One Belt, One Road is going to disappear overnight, and they're going to rotate east. And in the process, Germany will just naturally rotate towards Russia, who is, as we've said before many times, their natural ally. And you know, the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing is going to form the backbone of the One Belt, One Road going forward in the world. That is irrefutable. And I've said that for the last 5 years, that would eventually come to pass, before the One Belt, One Road really took off in earnest, because geopolitically, Germany was always going to rotate east to Russia. That was an inevitability. And Russia and China were always going to join at the hip. So that was going to obviously be the backbone of a new, well, Eurasian economic free trade zone, and allow nations to cooperate and work with each other in the way they should do. So you have proper, true globalization, not fake cabal globalization. And in the end, we come to the point where the idea is, well, yeah, Trump has to take a wrecking ball to the cabal. I said that before he was elected. That was his mandate. When he was elected, that's what his job's to do. Now, so obviously we can understand there's reasons for doing what he's doing, but I'd be less concerned about taking the wrecking ball to the cabal, which is in free fall and collapse anyway. I'm more concerned, okay, what's the collateral damage of my actions now for the US as my nation? Yeah, he cares about the US. I don't doubt that. He loves the US as a country, and for a president to really care about his nation is a great thing. But what's the collateral damage of my actions now in terms of the long-term recovery and integration of the US into a strong nation amongst equals? And there's no evidence that there's any consideration being given to that. And that's why, as well, the nuclear agreement's is significant, because if they walk away, that's only likely to antagonize European nations even further. And if the EU nations sort of pull at the drawbridge and go, well, actually, maybe we'll decide now to walk away from sanctions against Russia, and we're going to start reintegrating our trading, with Russia, which they could well do. Then where does that position the US? It just leaves them more and more isolated. And isolation is the last thing the US wants. As much as people talk about Trump being a protectionist, I don't really see Trump as being a protectionist, but his actions are causing the US to end up isolated, which I think is, well, it's a statement to the obvious. It's very, very detrimental for any nation in this world, particularly going forward, to be isolated. And I just think there's a more intelligent way of dealing with this from the US perspective, rather than, because it's self-evident to suggest, that the US economy, and he keeps coming back to this point of suggesting that, how strong the US economy is ridiculous. And what's also worth pointing out is that the JCPOA agreement, the nations that really made this happen more than anything was Berlin and Oman. they were the ones who brokered the deal in the first place and got it going, and everyone else jumped on board and agreed to it. So Berlin had a vested interest to want to allow this to happen. Why? Because they see the future of Persia as to be a huge economic, powerhouse in the new world. They were aware of this, and therefore they could benefit greatly from bilateral trade and other agreements. So that they don't want to see the deal destroyed. And it's probably worth going into the fact of the meeting between Merkel and Trump. I think it was less frosty than it was the last time they met. But there's considerable differences of opinion as to how NATO should be structured. And I agree from the US's perspective. Why the hell should the US pay the significant amount of the budget free requirements? And they're saying, well, all European nations should contribute 2% minimum of GDP per year. But he talks immediately in this meeting, goes on about our strong and robust manufacturing base in the US. And he's talking about how all this steel and aluminium plant are going to do really well in the US. So who's he trying to convince? Does he really think Merkel and the Germans are going to buy that? They won't buy that. Yeah, there is a huge trade deficit with the European Union. It's about 150 billion a year. And I think Trump was quoted saying that 50 billion of that is in autos and auto parts. Well, that's fine if you want to, but if your own car industries aren't interested or looking at moving out to the US or downscaling operation, you can't then say to the European Union, well, by the way, there's this huge deficit in autos. Go, well, your own major car producing companies are moving out. So what are you surprised then that we're going to fill the void in that market with quality cars that maybe more affordable? And yeah, Trump wants major reforms to the World Trade Organization, but that's not going to change the deficit. The US has to start producing things. You can't say to another nation, well, because we're not producing anything, you're going to have to rescale this arrangement in terms of bilateral trade and make it work. And you say to the US is you need to start producing more goods internally for an export market. But by the way, the problem is you can't afford to do that. You don't have any money to do that. How are you going to build? Your infrastructure needs to be upgraded. That's going to cost trillions, and therefore that would make the export market a lot more, cost effective. Imagine even if you did, significantly upgrade the US industrial base. The infrastructure is so poor, it would be very damaging to any export market in the process. And you kind of saw with the body language that as much as Trump says, there's a strong and thriving alliance between Germany and the US, you didn't feel it, you didn't see it. It wasn't obvious. And I think Germany feels that and senses that. And I think possibly the most damning comment, that Merkel made is when she basically admitted, well, going forward, we need to start considering our own, security. Europe needs to take its own destiny into its own hands. And there was this idea, well, during the Cold War and before unification and, the unification between East and West Germany, the world was very different. And therefore we needed the US more. And now they're basically saying, they're almost saying, going forward, we don't really need the US anymore. And we need to do things on our own, which kind of totally flies in the face of the idea that the world's under any imminent threat of significant war and conflict. Because you'd arguably say that the way things are now, to the average person, would go, hang on, that's contradictory, but it proves the reality that Germany knows how the world's changing and the risk of major conflict is over. It isn't entirely over in the Middle East. It's certainly dead and buried in North Korea, but we said that last summer it would never happen, way before a whole bunch of other things that are supposed to have led to it happening. I said last summer, there will never be a world war. There will never be any conflict between North Korea and anyone else. It's simply not going to be allowed to happen because the Russians and the Chinese said, if you do it, we'll destroy your entire South China Sea fleet. And we're serious, so back off and don't try to launch a preemptive strike. That's the reason why.
Possible, Paul. If you were listening to, That's not possible. If you were listening to me in the morning, you would know that we have the most vaunted military equipment in the world, Paul. We have aircraft carriers that can't launch aircraft. We have stealth fighters that cannot fly, they cannot turn, they cannot shoot, they cannot do anything. The list goes on and on. There's no way they could take us out. It's impossible. We have tanks we have huge boats that are called stealth ships. Even though you and I could see them from 10 miles away on the horizon, they're invisible. Did you know that, Paul? They're invisible.
Well, I think one thing that was encouraging is that, and Trump made a few comments with his speech with Merkel worthy of note. He kind of basically pointed out to the world just what the cabal deep state is like. I mean, he said that Washington can be a nasty place, and he turned to Merkel and said, "But you wouldn't be aware of that." And he pointed out was the accusations made against Jackson. Was he the VA guy? And he basically said how disgracefully he'd been treated.
Oh,
and bear in mind, exactly. And Obama and Bush had given this guy an A+ report. So this guy was beyond, any doubt, a totally solid individual. So he pointed that out and then dovetailed in the fact that it's the same problems I have, that the Russian collusion hoax is utter nonsense, which of course we know it is. He also pointed out, and shows the kind of idiotic nature of how administrations work, and not just the US, when he said that, okay, there's all the controversy about the US building an embassy in Jerusalem, but that's beside the point. He said somebody came to him and said he wanted $1 billion to build an embassy in Jerusalem, and he refused to sign it. And then he said the US ambassador to Israel, Friedman, said, look, we can build one for $150,000. And Trump went, well, let's make it a bit better than that, spend about $300,000 to $400,000 and make it, a pristine building. And therefore it's going to go ahead. But what it proves is look at the differential in cost between $1 billion and $400,000. I mean, it's not even a fraction. It's a drop in the ocean in comparison. But it shows the question is, if they wanted $1 billion, where was all the money going? Who was actually profiting? Because it never cost $1 billion to build an embassy. So it was good he made that point, because it was highlighting as an example to the world and the US people, look, this is what the deep state does, or the cabal does. They'll initiate a project that costs ridiculous amounts of money when you can build something for a fraction of the cost. So what's actually happening in that situation? So they were encouraging signs that he's trying to, in a very kind of roundabout and discreet way, suggest to the American people and beyond, look, this is how the world operates. This is the way it functions. I think when Merkel was asked about the steel and aluminium tariff, she basically almost said, well, we don't have any say in this. It's up to what Trump wants to do. Macron made a point where he said, which I think is a valid point last week, is when he said that we respect the sovereignty of all nations, including Iran. And someone asked him, well, is the US going to entertain military force? And he said, well, he didn't want to comment on that. So he didn't flatly say we're not going to enter into military force. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, because people say, well, he should have said that. Well, you're never going to say that. You would never comment and say you will or you won't. I don't think the US for 1 minute will. But he said, they're never going to be doing nuclear weapons. Well, no, because Iran doesn't want to do nuclear weapons. I think the interesting thing is where there was a point of disagreement, and this once again means that is likely to throw Germany towards Russia, is that the US were all about further sanctions against Russia, and Germany's now saying to the US, you can't do this, because you're really starting to hurt and kill us as the secondary effect of sanctions is really going to kill us even more than the first round of sanctions adopted in 2014, obviously before the Trump administration came into being. Germany, or Merkel, still trying to lay the blame of Ukraine on the shoulders of Russia too, with Crimea and Donbass, which is nonsense. There seems to be, whatever it is, wide agreement with regards to Syria between Germany and the US, but quite what that agreement is highly debatable. But the one thing Merkel did say, which is a very kind of passing throwaway comment but highly relevant, is I mean, she caveated it, well, it depends on Russia's behavior. But she said, we need to have good relations with Russia. So but of course they do. The realization is that, the Germany needs to have those strong relations with Russia for economic reasons, geopolitical reasons. And going forward, Russia will be reintegrated into Europe. This is why all this idea, the EU army was going to be a cabal army, and well, no. And here's the simple reason: why would the cabal need another army when it had NATO anyway? It doesn't need a European army. The European army is because NATO will cease to exist as it does now, and the Europeans will take care of their own security. And the reason they'll do that is because the Russians will be integrated with them. And let's face it, if you were sat there now after witnessing what's happened in Syria, if you were the Europeans, you'd be very happy to have the Russians on side with their military technology to support a joint military effort. Now, this joint military effort isn't about waging wars in the world. It's about protecting nations against the threat of terrorism. We come back to this point countless times, but it's relevant. International terrorism is the big threat in the future. When the cabal's gone, that risk of that isn't going to disappear overnight. And we know the potential risks that such terrorism can, particularly financial terrorism, can do to a nation. You could, in effect, hold an entire nation hostage just economically by paralyzing financial systems or whatever they might decide to do. And to rule out and say it's impossible, it would be seriously ignorant of a potential risk. If you ignore these things, they can happen, but if you take them seriously, then you significantly reduce the risk of that happening. But yeah, overall, I just didn't get any feeling that there's really any agreement between Germany and the US on anything. The JCPOA Merkel was all pro it, saying there wasn't a problem. She's trying to pacify Trump to an extent, going, well, it's not quite perfect, and we understand the US's position, but they don't want any changes to it because they know that Iran's, adhering to everything they're supposed to adhere to, and so does Britain, France, Germany, Britain, France, the Chinese, the Russians, and everyone else. And interestingly, yesterday there was telephone conversations between Theresa May and Macron and Merkel, and a statement came out based on all these phone calls that that they reaffirmed their support for the nuclear deal with Iran, noting, well, they're saying it's the best way to keep limitations on Iran's nuclear program, but also they agree that by sanctioning Iran, what are they going to do? Have to go along with sanctioning Iran? We'll tell that to Total and all their investment in Iraq already, and German companies looking to invest or are investing in Iran also. I mean, Britain less so, but they're not going to shoot themselves an economic bullet in the head just because of this Iran nuclear deal. So it all, in essence, we've come around full circle after all this time back to why the importance of the Iran nuclear deal in terms of what it actually means, and if the US walks away from it, or if they try to impose sanctions, I think it's pretty passive and it's a nodding agreement to a problem. But if they walk away from it, then that is a serious critical matter that could have consequential effects. And in truth, I'm not even sure Israel will be exactly thrilled by that. Yeah, they want renegotiation, but then in the next breath, the certain elements within Tel Aviv are clearly trying to provoke Iran into a response. So it's not entirely sort of clear as to what the Iranian point of view is, but I do suspect there is desperation in the Middle East. And here's the ultimate question. There's a number of schools of thought as to what the US's position on this is. They could very easily allow Israel to do what it wants to do and respond in no way, shape, or form, and leave Israel could be hung out to dry. And we can't dismiss that as not being a possibility. As much as I could be critical of the Trump administration's foreign policy, I'm equally mindful that there is a number of routes and a number of ways they can approach this. But the concern is, once again, and it always comes back to, we always said, well, we'll see what happens with respect to Bolton. We'll see what happens with respect to Pompeo. I think they've certainly given up. There's no intention of trying to meddle in North Korea, and because what's going to happen? Trump's going to turn up in North Korea after all the concessions that Kim Jong-un's made to back the US into the corner to basically say, well, actually, it's not good enough what you're doing, and as far as we're concerned, we're not interested in your peace agreement. They can't do that because the world's going to turn around and go, this is ridiculous. And even, particularly when so much of the US media and people are trying to talk Trump up to get a Nobel Peace Prize for North Korea, well, forget the whys and wherefores of that. You can't then do that, and then actually Trump seems to appear to be dissing the very thing that that North and South Koreans have sort of discussed, and that historical meeting last Friday, and everything that subsequently happened as a result of that. I can't see the Trump administration doing that. So North Korea, as far as the Kabbalists are concerned, which we have to divorce from the Trump administration and what he's trying to do, it's dead and buried. They can't do anything. Their last chance of stoking anything is in Syria in the Middle East. So, but again, the Trump administration can play a very, very blinding card and just leave them to it. But we saw what happened with respect to Syria. They had no reason to go in and launch missile attacks on Syria, and they didn't attack Kabul bases. They attacked, as we said, a pharmaceutical facility that was designing anti-cancer drugs. So this conspiracy that it was to destroy Kabul headquarters and Kabul facilities in Syria is just nonsense. And the only reason they didn't severely damage Syria was because of the Russian capability to intercept missiles and jam, and their jamming capability in to do with Navy destroyers. So therefore the question's still open. Well, what's the US policy with regards to Syria? And that's why I think the next 4 weeks or so, give or take, will be hugely significant and give us a huge indication in one aspect of how the Trump administration approaches the question in the Middle East to do with Iran and Syria. But the one thing is, and the US isn't stupid, they know that if they're ever to lock horns with the Iranians, they're not only going to have to deal with the Iranians, they'll have to deal with the Turks, the Chinese, and the Russians. And there's no way anybody in the US administration or the US military is going to go, hang on, that's a good idea. Let's decide to engage in some conflict with Iran. They may try to put more and more pressure on them, but I think a lot of that is because of from the Trump administration's perspective, it's just really bad advice and really duff intelligence to convince them that somehow Iran is this global presence who are behind all acts of terrorism and are threatening to stomp their way through Syria. And Trump made the comment of saying we don't want to extend their influence to the Mediterranean. Well, that's just
the craziest thing I've ever heard about Iran, Paul. The craziest thing I've ever heard is when these nut jobs were writing books about Shemitahs and Mitas, and they were writing these books stating that Iran wants to start World War III in order to bring forth their Imam Mahdi. I mean, this is the insanity of it. And Westerners, specifically Americans, just ate it up.
Well, this is why, my concern is that it's like anything. Trump is not Cabal, and he never has been, and he never will be. And I appreciate the difficulty of what he's trying to achieve and what he's trying to stem off and fight in terms of the onslaught that's existed through all the kind of whole Russian collusion bullshit. And there is no other word for it. It's utter bullshit. So I can appreciate all that. But in the process, coming out with inflammatory comments about Iran achieves nothing. It doesn't benefit the US to do this. And then the idea, oh well, Trump's playing a game and it's this gigantic game that he's playing. But by the way, the cabal doesn't know anything about this, even though you and I are discussing it, and so are millions of other people publicly. It just doesn't wash either. So there's things that Trump would be advised not to say, and the question is, why is he saying it? The only nation really, or nations who have any real issue or concern in reality with Iran is Israel and Saudi Arabia. No one else is bothered about them. No one thinks they're a problem. Whatever the reasons why Israel and Saudi Arabia think it is beside the point. That's the reality. So the only people he's appeasing in saying this is those nations. Because the rest of the world's going to go, well, actually, it doesn't make any sense because the Iranians are agreeing to the deal. You know, we negotiated the deal. They're doing everything they're supposed to do in the context of the deal. They're not breaching anything. But I mean, you can't then say, well, actually, this is a bad deal because suddenly we don't agree with it. Well, you know, okay, it was the Obama administration who negotiated and or signed up to the deal to whatever extent they negotiated. Beside the point. So okay, you may have issues, but there isn't. But it's only the Iranians who have, the Israelis more than anyone who have a concern about this because they have this idea that, you know, somehow, you know, as you say, that the Iranians are going to launch a missile attack. And if Iran suddenly unilaterally attacked Israel, no one's going to win in the Middle East. The entire Middle East would just be vaporized. So they're not going to do that. But the Israelis, for whatever reason, have this inbred fear. That's what they're going to do. But it's not going to happen. So therefore, that's why I say I don't understand why at times Trump makes comments he does. Sometimes he makes very intelligent remarks, and he exposes things in very subtle ways to raise people's awareness, like he said about effectively telling people how the cabal, deep state, whatever you want to call it, works in Washington. That was very, you know. But then he comes and puts his foot in and accuses Iran of being this murderous regime that's responsible or behind every terrorist act that happens in the Middle East. Well, hang on a minute, Donald. The small thing is, who's been fighting ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, in Syria, along with the Russians and the Syrians? It's the Iranians. So what you're saying makes absolutely no sense. You can't leverage. And where's the proof? And here's the thing: if there was any proof Iran was involved in this, do we not actually think by now that evidence would have been produced and used to impose more sanctions and more punitive control over Tehran? Of course it would have been. And if it was true, the world would say, hang on a minute, we'll sign up to this. The reason they don't is there is no evidence, and the rest of the world doesn't believe Iran's doing anything wrong in that regard or anything to do with the nuclear deal, which of course they're not. And that is what I don't understand. Sometimes it's best to say nothing if you haven't got anything really worthwhile to say. And with regards to Iran, it'd be better to say very little. You might say we have concerns about the deal and we'd like to renegotiate it. But don't, you know, throw high octane language around to do with Iran, because the Iranians are not going to tolerate it. It's one thing saying it to the North Koreans, but North Korea is, in comparison to Iran, militarily and geopolitically, is at the moment is an insignificant nation in comparison.
Absolutely. Paul, closing statements, man. Go for it.
Well, I guess it's like we always say, just pay attention to the reality of what's unfolding. And again, and we raise the point, don't get bogged down by dates. You know, I'm not going to labor the point, but I'm going to say one thing because it's important. There's certain people making, or I don't know what they are, going, oh, these major things were going to happen in March. Well, it didn't happen. Oh no, the major things are going to happen in April. Well, it's April the 30th. It hasn't happened. Is it? Oh, it's going to happen in May. Well, it might happen in May. It might happen tomorrow. It might happen in June. It could be July. It might be October next year. There is no dates attached to this. And therefore the problem is it's detrimental, because on the one hand, people will just go, well, you know, and well, I've had it levied at me, well, I'm sorry, you don't know what's going on because there's this plan and it's all unfolding. And well, it hasn't unfolded in March and April. And so therefore, how long do you say to somebody, you know, if Rogue Money or the Sirius report came out and I'd made statements about this in March and April and it didn't happen, I'd be slaughtered. I'd be pilloried. I'd have people getting in touch going, you're talking rubbish, you don't know what you're saying, we don't want to subscribe to you anymore. We'd have had a huge amount of backlash, both of us. I think but people continue to hang on to the idea of these dates and all these things happening. Yes, things are going to happen, but not necessarily how anyone envisaged. It's like the reset. The financial reset isn't going to pan out how anyone imagines it's going to be. Rather like, yes, there will be adjudication of people, and it will happen, but it's not going to happen how people imagine. Not suddenly like we get up one day and there's been this seismic shift and all of a sudden we can rip open thousands of indictments and arrest all these people. That's not how the system works. You can't expect it to. It doesn't mean that people aren't going to be adjudicated, and it may happen. Next week someone might get adjudicated. But don't get bogged down by dates, because the problem is I've seen this happen for the last, 5 years at least, where people are being given a lot of hope about dates, and dates have come and gone, it hasn't happened. Then people get very frustrated and very disheartened. And then they look for the next idea that, all these major changes are going to happen, try and find someone to latch onto. And then they go through this process and they get frustrated. And I've also had people getting in touch saying, well, we got told these things were going to happen in March and April. They haven't happened. I think of Trump's cabal. There's no hope for the US. Well, that's not true either. So don't get hooked on dates. I believe that the only way you can judge anybody is by the track record of what they say and what unfolds. And if you've got a good track record of getting things correct and being accurate about things, then that's how you judge someone. Don't judge someone by being vague and by promising dates that don't come to pass. Because otherwise, on what basis do you have any criteria to judge people's capabilities? And I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I'm not, people say, well, why don't you talk about certain things? Well, I don't talk about things because I'm not going to get interested in discussing dates. Yeah, I've heard dates. I've heard dates for the last 5 years, and they've never come to pass in any respect, in any regard. I've heard dates for this year about certain things happening, but I'm never going to discuss them because I don't think they're ever going to come to pass. And if I do, all I'm going to do is get shot down in flames and say, well, there you go, the date never happened. You're just talking rubbish. And that's why we don't get stuck into the realm of what happens with date. But it doesn't mean things aren't going to happen.
Paul, that's because Paul, that's because you and I do not have the powers of remote viewing. That's what it is. That's what we lack.
But it's true, but it is frustrating because, we try to deal with the tangible reality of things. And there is no doubt.
I agree with you 100%, man. I mean, people have been writing me, how come you're not giving dates anymore? Because, you get hits, you get misses, overall is a pretty good ratio. I'm just like, at this point, it doesn't even matter. Predictions don't even, everything's event driven right now. And I don't think people fully grasp that when you and I keep saying, this is event driven. Take your timelines, take your calendars, throw it out the window. Throw it out the window. Nobody has a perfect time. There's so much chaos. And this is what I think a lot of these people who tune into programs like us, thinking that they're going to find conspiracy radio 101 with us, Paul, and they're sorely mistaken. They're sorely mistaken because it's not a cabal that runs the world with absolute scientific precision and godlike abilities that's controlling every little facet of every good-driven global event. It's not at all. There's hundreds of factions, thousands of agendas that are at play right now, and people just don't seem to have the ability to grasp that. A lot of people just they miss it. The world is not as simple as people think, and people need to get that, Paul.
No, it is. It's, as we said, it's thousands of shades of grey, and there's, I liken the analogy. There's thousands of plates spinning all at once, and it is incredibly complex. It's incredibly convoluted. And this is why, there was expectations 2 years ago that, it would be the end and the reset was going to happen. And it never happened. And because a whole bunch of other reasons kicked into play. And it's the one thing, if you tread on a virtual mine, the alarm bells that go off inside the cabal, because they've rigged the system to realize if someone hits a trip, hits a virtual mine or flicks, a trip switch or something. They're aware of things. Therefore, you can flick a switch and suddenly a whole bunch of unintended consequences out, which pushes everything back weeks, months, or years in some cases in the past. It's not that simple. So, that's why the idea, something is happening this week, next week. This is why you will end up with dates coming and going, and therefore in the process, don't hang your hat on people coming out with dates, because if you said to the Chinese, when are these things going to happen, they go, we don't. Not that they're going to discuss it, but they're going to go, we don't know. We can't give you precise dates, neither can the Russian, neither can the US government or anyone else, because it's not, you know, the Trump administration, it's not that simple. It's far more complicated. And the other thing is, at the end of the day, you have to do things correctly. You don't, you know, there's no good telling the world we're going to change everything, but by the way, we're going to be slipshod and we're just going to be ham-fisted about things, because that's okay for us to do that. Things have to be done efficiently and correctly. And in terms of adjudicating people, it's like when all those texts were supposed to be released to do with Page and Strzok, and then the information came out and it was heavily redacted, and everyone's, oh, we were told this was going to happen. Well, what do they expect? Of course, it's going to be heavily redacted. This is how, but eventually the process will be at some point. Maybe that redaction will be removed and the information will become available. But one last point I wanted to make, and it's just something that I meant to say, and this proves quite eloquently the problems that the Trump administration faces. We had the whole issue of the JFK files. Now, remember, there was a deadline imposed last year for the full release of files, and then there was this issue. Look, you know, certain individuals need, you know, more time to assess certain of the files because of barring national security and privacy concerns. Now, so there was this big anticipation. Oh, these files are going to, you know, release a whole, you know, unleash a hornet's nest. You know, it didn't. And then the deadline came to pass with Trump allowing a number of documents, quite a substantial amount, granting agencies this approval for a few months breathing space. What do we now find? Trump's extended that till 2021. And this is the most telling aspect. He came out and said, I agree with the recommendation that the continued withholdings are necessary to protect against identifiable harm to national security, law enforcement, or foreign affairs that is of such gravity that it outweighs the public interest in immediate disclosure. Now, people will jump on that and go, oh, he's just cabal, that's why he's not releasing it. No, that's not the reality. But what that tells us is when there's this idea that we're just going to open the floodgates, all these indictments are going to happen. And bear in mind, we're talking about JFK, obviously from 1963. We're talking about something that happened 50 odd years ago. Obviously, JFK is no longer with us, and probably most of the people associated with that investigation and written in those redactments are either retired or probably not with us anymore either. We're talking about indictments on people who are still alive, who would probably have far more harm to our national security, law enforcement, or foreign affairs. And that's the other point. You unleash a whole bunch of information about somebody, the usual suspect. What's that going to do for US international relations with other nations when they go, what? This person did this to our nation? If he thinks there's a problem with the information to do with JFK, what does that tell you about all these sealed indictments and the identifiable harm to national security? But people just think, no, just throw it all out there, and that's the best way of dealing with it. It's not. It's an idealistic viewpoint to take that idea that that's how you do this. You can't do this, and that's why the process is slow and takes a long time. It has to be handled in a way. There's no good saying to the world, well, all this happened, and then you create this enormous shitstorm for the US as a nation internationally, or you cause massive internal problems within the country. What good's that to the average American person? At the end of the day, doing all this has to be done in the best interest of the American people to protect them in the short term. I'm not saying you shouldn't disclose information. I totally agree. And before anyone jumps down my throat and says I'm suggesting to the contrary, because I'm not. But it's a classic example of how this has to be handled in a certain way. And it's not this simplistic idea that we just throw it all out there and see what sticks and what shitstorm ensues. And that goes for every other nation in that respect as well.
Correct.
And that's an important consideration in how we approach this. And that's why, don't get frustrated if, it might happen something gets released next week, next month. But if we're sat here in 3 or 4 months' time and it hasn't happened, don't be surprised. That's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. Paul, thank you so much for joining us again and sharing your views and especially the goings on and giving us the latest updates of what's going on in the world. Folks, again, you can find them on thesiriusreport.com. That's spelled The Sirius Report. And Sirius is spelled Sirius, as in the dog star Sirius. Thesiriusreport.com. Go there, subscribe, become a member, and be enriched. And with that being said, folks, we are over and out. Enjoy your weeks.